Good morning, students. Welcome to the 5th semester, subject financial management, session number 62. So in this session, we are going to study about what are the determinants of working capital and the sources of working capital. The objective of this session is to understand the factors which will determine the working capital requirements of an organization and also the sources available for working capital. So what is the outcome of studying this session means? We are going to just understand and recall what are the factors which will determine the working capital requirements of an organization, whether an organization will require more working capital or less working capital, and also the sources which are available for an organization for financing the working capital. So among them, the first one is nature of the business. So nature of the business will determine whether an organization will require more working capital or less working capital. So therefore, the requirement of an organization, the working capital requirement of an organization will depend upon the nature of the business. So depending upon the nature of the business, a firm may need more working capital or less working capital. For example, take public utilities like electricity, water supply and railways, which are service oriented business. They need very little working capital as they offer cash sales only. So when they are offering for cash sales, whatever business they are doing today, the total amount they are going to get today itself, and therefore they do not have inventories and receivables also. They are not going to store any goods for future use. Whatever is their investment is, it is in fixed assets. So therefore, and also the business is carried on the basis of cash, and therefore because they don't have inventories and receivables, their working capital requirement will be less. On the other hand, take the trading and manufacturing organizations. They require sufficient working capital as they have to invest in the inventories, bills receivables and accounts receivables. Today they buy the raw material, convert them into finished goods, and then they will sell on credit basis, and after the credit time is over, you are going to get back the cash. Therefore, trading organizations require more working capital than the public utilities. The second one is size of the business and scale of operations. So the working capital requirements of an organization is greatly influenced by the size of its business. Greater the size of the business, generally larger will be the requirements of working capital. So if it is a big business organization and the scale of operations are more, to fund its business they require more working capital. On the other hand, a concern carrying on activities on a small scale needs less working capital. Next point is growth and expansion of business. So the growth and expansion plans of the business also will affect the working capital requirement of a business organization. So when there is a continuous growth and expansion of a business, those firms will require more working capital than a business which are carrying on their activities constantly over the years. So if there is growth and expansion of the business, they require more working capital. If there is no growth and expansion and they are working on a constant basis, they will require less working capital. The next point is length of operating cycle. So the working capital requirement is directly influenced by the length of the operating cycle or manufacturing cycle. The longer the manufacturing time, greater is the working capital requirement. Shorter the manufacturing cycle time, shorter is the working capital requirement. So any business which is taking longer manufacturing time or operating cycle will require more working capital. On the other hand, a business having a lesser manufacturing time or operating cycle will have a lesser amount of working capital because they are able to convert their inputs into cash on a very quick basis. The next point is production policies. Production policies also determine whether a business organization requires more working capital or less working capital. Capital intensive industry will require more fixed capital and less working capital. So, if the business is following a capital intensive production policy, then they require more amount of investment in fixed assets and less amount in the current assets or the working capital. On the other hand, if it is a labor intensive industry, then they require less amount of investment in fixed assets and more amount of investment in working capital. Then the next point is rate of stock turnover. So there is a high degree of correlation between the rapidity of the turnover and the amount of working capital requirement. So firms having high rate of stock turnover will require less working capital. If you are able to convert your stock into sales very quickly, then that type of businesses will require less working capital. On the other hand, a firm which is having lower stock turnover ratio or lower stock turnover, those companies will require more working capital. Example, take a vegetable vendor. He has a very high sales rate turnover or sales turnover ratio because whatever he invests in the morning, he is able to get back the amount of investment by evening. And then compare him with a jeweler who has invested lakhs of rupees on the goods, on the stock, but he is not able to sell all the stock in a day or two or in a week. Therefore, his stock turnover ratio is low and therefore he will require more working capital. Then the next point is seasonal fluctuation in demand. So seasonal fluctuations in demand also will determine whether an organization will require more working capital or less working capital. Example, the demand for the goods of a woolen factory increases during winter and decreases in summer. So as a result, these type of companies will require more working capital during winter and the working capital requirement will decrease in summer. So, depending upon the demand, that is a seasonal demand, the working capital requirement will be determined. So, in a season when there is more activities, then they require more working capital. In a season where there is less demand, they will require less working capital. The next point is business cycles. So, when the business is prosperous or when the economy is in prosperity, there is a need for larger amount of working capital due to increase in sales, rise in prices and so on. So, when there is prosperity in the economy, during that time the organization will require more working capital to fund its activities. On the other hand, during the times of depression, the business will contract, sales will decline, and there will be difficulties in collecting the amount from debtors, and then the firms may also have large amount of working capital lying idle, and therefore during those times they may not require much of the working capital. So during the times of prosperity they require more working capital, during the times of depression they require less working capital. Next point is fluctuations in supplies. So, if an organization is having continuous supply, then the working capital required will be less. On the other hand, if a company is facing too much of fluctuations in the supplies, then they require more working capital. For example, if the raw material is available only during certain seasons, then it has to be stored in larger quantities to provide for periods when supplies will not be available. Then the working capital requirement will be more. On the other hand, if a business is getting its supplies frequently without any problem, then the working capital requirement will be less. Next one, operating efficiency. A firm enjoying operating efficiency can reduce wastages and thereby the working capital needs is considerably reduced. So if there is much operating efficiency, they require less working capital. On the other hand, if the operating efficiency is low, then they require more working capital. The next one is credit facilities enjoyed from creditors. So a firm which is enjoying liberal credit facilities from its suppliers or creditors will need lower working capital. So a firm which is enjoying credit facilities from its creditors on a liberal basis will require less working capital because their payment schedule is postponed. On the other hand, if the credit facilities are not available from the creditors and suppliers, we have to make immediate payments for our requirement, then the working capital requirement will be more. Next point is price level changes. In the periods of rising prices, a firm has to pay higher prices for the purchases. In the periods of rising prices, or it is a period where the prices of the materials are continuously rising, then a firm has to pay higher prices for the purchases, and therefore to pay higher charges for the purchases they require more working capital. On the other hand, if the prices are not changing and are constant, they require a constant working capital. The next point is government regulations. The Tendon Committee has prescribed norms for holding inventories and debtors which a concern is not expected to exceed. So this factor will affect the working capital requirement of a concern. The company or the organization has to compulsorily maintain the amount, the minimum amount what they have prescribed on the debtors and inventories and not more than that. And therefore, the government regulation will affect the working capital requirement of an organization. Next one is profit level. Higher profit margins will result in higher generation of internal funds, and therefore this will contribute to the working capital. So a firm which is earning higher profits will require less working capital. On the other hand, firms which are earning lower profit will require more working capital. Another point is dividend policy. The liberal dividend policy which is practiced by an organization will require more working capital. So if an organization is following a liberal dividend policy, then they require more working capital to fund its dividend payout. And therefore, if an organization is having high dividend payout ratio, then more working capital is required. On the other hand, if an organization is having low dividend policy or a strict dividend policy, then the working capital requirements of the organization will be less. The next point is taxes. If the tax imposed by the government is high, then the company is left out only with less profits with the company, and hence the working capital requirement is low. So during the periods of higher taxes, more working capital is required than the period during which there is low tax rates. The last point is depreciation policy. Higher the depreciation charged by the company, then much of the funds or the funds available is reduced for dividend, and thereby checks the outflow of working capital in the form of cash for dividends. So if more depreciation is charged, less profits is available, and if less profits are available, less dividend is payable. During this time, we require less working capital. So if we are following a low depreciation policy, more profits are available, then more dividend has to be declared. During that time, we require more working capital. So these are the factors which will determine how much working capital an organization should have, less or more. Then the other topic is sources of working capital. So from where do we get the working capital for an organization? So it can be classified into three types: long-term financing, short-term financing, and spontaneous financing. So the long-term sources are loans, term loans from financial institutions, public deposits accepted by the companies for a longer period of time, redeemable debentures which will be redeemed after a particular time, and also redeemable preference shares, flowing back of profits or the retained earnings. All these are the long-term financing of working capital of an organization. So what are the short-term sources available to an organization? Means they are the trade credit, which are allowed in the normal course of business, the bank credit, customer advances, and also the short-term public deposits. Then we have the third one is the spontaneous financing. So here we have the long-term sources of financing of working capital: loans from financial institutions, debentures, public deposits, the internal source, which is also called as a retained earnings or flowing back of profit, preference shares and equity shares. Then the short-term financing of working capital are short-term loans from the banks in the form of overdraft, cash credit, then issuing of commercial papers, factoring the debts, receiving advances from the customers, and selling goods on installment. Then the third one we have spontaneous financing of working capital. So spontaneous financing refers to the automatic sources of short-term funds. The major sources of such financing are the trade credit. So here trade credit, that is creditors and bills payable, and also the outstanding expenses. So here we are just postponing the payment to the future date, and these sources of finance are always free of cost. That is one advantage. So this is relating to the topic determinants of working capital, or the factors determining the working capital requirement of an organization, and also the sources of working capital. Here we have a few multiple choice questions. The sources available for long-term financing of working capital for a business organization are loans from financial institutions, debentures, public deposits. So all the above holds good. The internal sources of working capital available for an organization is, we have the options like equity shares, preference shares, retained earnings, and debentures. So the internal source is the retained earnings. So the retained earnings is the right answer. Next we have customer advance is a short-term source of working capital, true or false. So it holds true. Spontaneous financing refers to the dash sources of short-term funds. So they are automatic sources of short-term funds. The price level changes may affect the working capital requirements of a firm, true or false. So it is true. Then liberal dividend policy followed by an organization requires dash working capital, more, less, moderate, and nil. So if an organization is following liberal credit dividend policy, or they are giving more dividends from the profits, then definitely they will require more working capital. So if the stock turnover ratio of an organization is more, then it will require nil, more, less, or moderate. So it will require less working capital, because from the sales we are generating the profits and cash is coming back into the organization, or investment is coming back into the organization. A labor-intensive organization requires more investment in dash and less investment in dash. So working capital and fixed capital is the right answer. So a labor-intensive organization requires more investment in working capital and less investment in fixed capital. And these are the few books for reference.